Thank you. We had a fair amount of discussion earlier this morning about career readiness being both an essential part of this agenda and a not yet well-defined part of it. And we think, therefore, we need to pay quite a bit more attention to that issue, and we want to start that discussion here this morning. So we have an outstanding panel to do that. I want to introduce them to you and then turn it over to Susan Bodary from Education First, who will be moderating this session. Susan has been in the Achieve family in one way or another for a long time. Actually, in one way or another, everyone on this panel has been working with Achieve or connected to Achieve in some manner. So let me take my glasses off so I can read and then introduce people. Gary Hoachlander, who's the president of Connect Ed in California, a leading organization on career and technical education. Gary, I think you've been to most, if not all, of the ADP meetings and keep pushing us to do a better job on career and technical education than we have in career readiness, and this is another opportunity to help us get it right, so I appreciate your being here. Kim Green from the Executive Director of the National Association of State Directors of Career and Technical Education, has also been a partner with us. We've got a little bit of work going on in some states to connect academics and CTE more closely than we have, so thank you for being here, Kim. Paul Reville from Massachusetts, Governor, what's his name? Governor Deval Patrick's office. He's the Secretary of Education there. Governor Patrick is a member of the Achieve Board of Education, and so Paul has been part of the Achieve family for quite some time. And Bob Schwartz is truly the father of the Achieve family. Bob was my predecessor as founding president of Achieve. Probably most of you know a report he's put out recently on pathways to careers. That has been getting a fair amount of attention around the country. So Bob's got a lot to say about this as well. And my job here is now to turn it over to Susan Bodary and let you start the conversation.
Thank you, Mike. I think we're mic'd, so you can take that one with you.
I'll take my mic with me.
Good morning. We wanted to have an opportunity to talk about college and career readiness, that intentional and between the two. It's not an or. And way back when the American Diploma Project research was done back in the mid-90s, and before we launched into the American Diploma Project Network, a couple of important things happened. One was that at the very beginning, there were just 3 states who were sitting in a room getting ready for that high school summit. And those chiefs said, well, I'll do it if you'll do it, and I'll do it if you do it. Because we know it's critically important that we raise the bar for all of our students. And so with that conversation and with Matt and Mike taking on the mantle of leadership, that's where the network was born. And yet 5 weeks later, 13 states stood up together and said, the and in college and career readiness is critically important, and we want to get to that space. What we've learned over time, however, is that word college has been an interesting challenge for us. And so over the last few years, there's been a dawning reality that college is not only about a 4-year baccalaureate degree, although that is absolutely critically important, and students should have the opportunity, all of our students should have the opportunity to choose that pathway and be prepared to go down that path. But we also know that an expanded definition, one that includes post-secondary experiences where students are earning certificates and degrees of value in the marketplace, at the AA level, at the BA level, and beyond, absolutely essential for working within our economy. So as we've been going down that path of an expanded definition of the word college or post-secondary, it has been an important reality for us to also to think about, well, what does that mean for career readiness? ADP allowed us to think about English language arts and mathematics in preparation being essentially the same for college and career readiness. We now have Common Core state standards on those issues that allow us to have a scaffold to build on there. And we've got 45 states who've now adopted those standards and are preparing, and are many already marching in terms of implementing them. And it really is important for us to step back for a moment and recognize that the way that the standards are put together, reading complex informational text, drawing evidence from text and being able to draw conclusions from it, looking in mathematics at modeling and statistics, allows us different ways to look at the work going forward. Once we combine this with what we know about our current economy and the jobs that are coming forward in it, really important that we dig deeper into what our definition of career ready is. And I'm going to give you a few statistics from Tony Carnevale's recent works. He's going to be here tomorrow to spend more time with you, but just to set the framework. So the projection is that by 2018, 63% of all jobs will require at least some post-secondary education. Employers are projected to need 22 million new workers with post-secondary degrees, and the estimates are that we're going to fall short by at least 3 million on that number. And that translates to about 300,000 college graduates every year. But here's a really important thing to know. The 22 million is AA degrees and BA degrees. And there's also a need for an additional significant number, 4.7 million workers with post-secondary certificates of value in the marketplace. And when we look at the numbers for earning potential in careers, we're also seeing something important happening. That what you choose to study, what you choose to get your credential and your degree in matters greatly, and that there are a whole host of middle skills careers and jobs out-earning BA degree holders. So important for us to keep all of these things in mind. In addition, there's 90% of the jobs in the 4 or 5 fastest growing occupational clusters require post-secondary education. And we're not talking clusters that are out of the realm, right? We're talking about healthcare and technical occupations, STEM occupations, community services, and others. So this all begs the question, if we know that we have had an expanded conversation around college, we need to begin to embrace the and between college and career readiness and have an expanded conversation around what does it take beyond English language arts and math. What else needs to be in place for career ready to really be true for all of us? Yesterday, there was also a release of a new book by Tom Friedman called That Used to Be Us. And one of the quotes in that book I find fascinating. He posits that we need to be able to educate, imagine, and invent our way out of this current economic crisis. And beyond that, that employers are looking for people in the workplace who can adapt, invent, and reinvent their jobs. So not just about the kind of academic core skills that we're looking for, but an expanded definition of what it means to be successful in the workplace. So given that framing, what I'd like to do is have a dialogue with our panelists who have a variety of different views, and I know won't be shy in this conversation. And I'd like to start with Paul. Paul, as we think about this college and career ready in a way that includes a more nuanced view of post-secondary experiences and honors the and in college and career ready, what do we need to keep in mind in that conversation? How is it that we need to be talking about where we're going with this vision?
Well, thank you, Susan. And I first of all, I think the most important response I could make to that question is to say we need to begin by starting to have the conversation itself. So I'm encouraged that we're gathered here today to talk about this, and I commend Achieve and the ADP network for framing the conversation so that we can have it. I'd also commend my colleague Bob Schwartz for the Pathways to Prosperity report, which have challenged us to examine our thinking here. It's a topic that as we talk about it, I sense at some level we're walking on eggshells as we talk about this. We're framing our words very carefully. We're anxious about not setting the wrong ideologies in motion here as we talk about this. So in a way, it's, particularly for those of us at the state level, this is a courageous conversation to have. And I know our Board of Education, our commissioner, we have our delegation from Massachusetts here, Commissioner Mitchell Chester is with us, Maura Betta, our chair. Governor Patrick, we're concerned about this conversation. We're concerned about having it. We're putting together a committee of the board to actually take a look at this and begin to statewide concentrate on how we integrate an education that is going to prepare people to be both college and career ready. A couple things I want to say about this beyond having the courage to have the conversation. Let me start with an anecdote. I have a son who's an activist, an internet activist and pioneer, works in the nonprofit sector. 32 years old, he's an Ashoka Fellow. He's been very successful at what he's done. He has a sort of free-floating internet corporation that does things that I couldn't even explain to you. But he has been at this for some time. He's got a dozen employees all over the world. he and I were having dinner recently. He was talking about a conversation with his colleagues in this same sector and how desperate they are these days to hire people with computer programming skills, and how those skills are at a level that really in secondary education they could be cultivated. A pipeline could be developed so that people getting out of secondary school would be ready to fill some of these jobs. Certainly people early in a college career at associate's degree level would be ready to fill these jobs. He talked about how one of his colleagues recently had gone for a high 5-figure salary to Botswana to hire somebody with the skills necessary to do the work that needed to be done in that sector. And he was sort of saying to me as an education policy person, what are you doing to align some kind of a pipeline that would prepare young people in your state for very good, high-paying jobs that are out there, but they aren't coming forward, and I don't know why this is. Somebody has to talk to the kids about it to make them aware that these opportunities exist, and then educators themselves have got to put in place the mechanisms for getting them ready. So that brings me to the larger, more philosophical framing of this for the conversation, and then I'll stop, which is just, in Massachusetts, we talk as much about preparing young people for success as we do for college and career readiness. And what we mean by success is the capacity to get and to hold and to develop in a high knowledge, high skill 21st century job that will enable you to support yourself and support your family. Beyond that, we say we want them to be active citizens and leaders in our democracy. We want them to be heads of families with the values and characteristics we associate with family leadership. And we want them to be lifelong learners. So keeping our eye on what we mean that goes beyond just college and career success, I think is an important element of this conversation. And that somehow the goals and accountability systems that we've established and done well with in a place like Massachusetts have taken us so far in this journey. But whipping those systems ever harder isn't necessarily going to produce the result. It's going to be about strategies, and it's going to be about a more differentiated, hybridized system that meets each of our children where he or she is and gives them what they need to get to the goal. So when I see work that's going on in this sphere that encourages me in Massachusetts, I see it in our vocational systems. I see it in systems that apply knowledge and give young people the opportunity to engage actively in that work. We see some very exciting things there that combine not only career readiness, but have catapulted our vocational schools from being kind of thought of as a backwater academically to leading the state in terms of their average performance relative to comprehensive high schools. So I think there's some very encouraging work that goes to the both and, but I think we need to have this conversation about what does success mean, what do we mean by career, what do we mean by college readiness, and have the courage to have it and not do what we so often do in education circles, which is to get into our foxholes in a very bipolar kind of conversation that's either or, and have exactly the kind of conversation we're preparing to have today.
Great, thanks, Paul. I mean, Kim, you've been coming at this from the career tech perspective in particular, and really working to try to integrate. I mean, what are your thoughts about how do we talk about this where the and becomes important?
My first thought was we can't repeat school to work, where college and career readiness becomes something new. This really needs to be about fundamental reform of the existing systems that we have, and it can't be just a career tech thing. We want all students, as you said, to be successful, and so just to simply reform the career tech system is really only serving some students. So we certainly have been working to make sure that the career tech system can meet this standard and can offer opportunities for students that are both college and career ready. But I almost worry that the new lexicon that we've created, college and career ready, allows us to perpetuate silos that exist in states. It's almost like we need to come up with something new to call it, because we are going to still have people who say these kids are college ready, these kids are career ready, and then we have our separate tracks. I was with a now senator who was at a meeting who said, thank goodness for CTE. There are some kids who are head smart and some kids who are hand smart. It's just another way of kind of relabeling this conversation. This, to me, is really about fundamental reform of the education system, because all kids need to be college and career ready.
Great. And Bob, you've been researching, writing, living some of this work. I mean, what are your thoughts in this area?
A couple of thoughts. Let me begin by putting some facts on the table that kind of pick up on Susan's framing. Really, the jumping off point for our Pathways report was the recognition that if you ask what proportion of young people by their mid-20s have a baccalaureate degree, it's about 30%, and it's only budged marginally over the last decade. If you then ask, okay, what additional proportion of young people have an associate's degree, that gets you to about another 10%. If you ask then what proportion of kids have some form of occupational certificate that seems to have currency in the labor market, that gets you maybe to about another 10%. So we're talking about roughly half the kids with some form of recognized credential. And in this economy, obviously not good enough. Second fact, that is, there was a report recently tracking the graduates of four-year institutions, class of 2010. Roughly 44% of those graduates of four-year institutions either were unemployed or working in jobs that didn't really require a four-year degree. Third fact from Florida, class of 2009, how are they doing in the labor market? For people with two-year technical degrees, they are out-earning by about $10,000 the baccalaureate degree holders from the public higher education institutions in Florida. If you put those pieces of information together, it suggests that we really need to come at this in a fundamentally different way. For me, the framing has to be, how do we ensure that all kids arrive in their early 20s, I would argue, with the skills and credentials that have currency in the workplace, and that can, in fact, move them, as Paul was suggesting, on to not just careers, but lives that are fulfilling, and that ultimately give them the kind of economic capacity to not only support themselves, but to support a family. I would argue that the right frame for us is to think that it's not the only function of high schools by any means, but one of the core functions has to be to prepare all young people with the kind of broad career and employability skills that are essential. And in my view, making sure that everybody has a solid academic foundation, which has been what much of the push of Achieve and the diploma project and the network has been about, that all kids have a solid academic foundation. They have the ability to keep on learning throughout life. I put that as, in a sense, a kind of subsidiary objective to the broader objective of trying to make sure that we really are supporting kids to develop the kinds of knowledge, skills, and dispositions to get a successful launch on a career. Just a final kind of comment on that, again on the statistics that Susan was citing, just to reinforce her point. In Tony Carnevale's workforce projections to 2018, 30%, in his view, of the jobs that will be needed by 2018, 30% will require some post-secondary education, but short of a bachelor's degree. These are the so-called middle skill jobs that Susan was alluding to. And so somehow we need to develop a focus on absolutely making sure that we continue on a path to try to increase the proportion of young people who are acquiring bachelor's degrees, and we in particular need to try to make sure that that population more accurately reflects the student demographics. It's absolutely, how do I put this, totally unacceptable and shocking that if you come from a family in the upper fifth of the income distribution in the US, your chances of acquiring a bachelor's degree are roughly 10 times greater than if you come from the bottom fifth of the economic distribution. And obviously that income distribution reflects race divisions as well as class. We've got to keep one eye on that ball of increasing not only the overall proportion of young people with bachelor's degrees, but really changing the demographics. But I would argue, and maybe if we want to get real and talk about, what's a 10-year goal that we might aspire to, maybe we could get that up to 40%. Then the real question comes, what's our strategy for helping the other 60% of young people get the credentials and skills they need? And that's where two-year institutions, apprenticeship programs, certificate programs need to take a much, much more central role in our planning and thinking.
Right. And Gary, I know you have thoughts about how we should be talking about this, how we should be visioning on this point so that we can really hit home these important concepts. But I'd also love you to dig into a little bit of the work that you're doing around this being this need for an integrated learning experience that attends to academics as well as career exposure and career readiness, if you could.
So thank you, Susan. And so to answer that question, I want to take you to Palmdale, California. Those of you who don't know your California geography, Palmdale's down in the middle of the desert. It's right next to Edwards Air Force Base, where until about a month ago we landed the shuttle when it couldn't land in Florida. Palmdale High School is about 3,500 students. About half are eligible for free and reduced lunch. It's about 60% Latino, about 20% African American. And at Palmdale High School, there is the Health Careers Academy, which serves about 500 of the 3,500 students. It's a comprehensive 4-year program of study. I was there on a Friday, June 6th, about 2 years ago, with a senior class. All of the seniors in the Health Careers Academy at Palmdale are required to do a group internship. There are 3 mornings a week during their second semester. We're there Friday, June 6th, and they're at Kaiser Hospital. Kaiser has provided a physician's assistant who is working side by side with the classroom teacher who is there with her 25 students. And the students are learning how to do electrocardiograms. Many of you, if you're as old as I have, many of you have had that experience. These students are working on real students. They're putting on that gel, attaching the leads. They're working with the physician's assistant to interpret the results. This is real hands-on experience. That same afternoon, we're back in their AP biology class. The lights in the room are turned off because it's 110 degrees. The school's not air conditioned. Lights are off just to keep the temperature down. And their AP class, every one of these kids is engaged because the lesson that afternoon is about the human cardiovascular system and the role that electricity plays in regulating the human heart and how heart disease interferes with that electrical system. And therefore, we need technology that can help us interpret and diagnose those kinds of malfunctions of the electrical system in the human heart. And that, of course, is precisely what those students were doing in the morning at Kaiser. Now, that did not happen by accident. A teacher planned that kind of connection. Very powerful connection between, I learned more about my own heart and my own cardiovascular system that afternoon in Palmdale High School than I learned in years of high school biology and biology in college. And I learned it because there was a direct connection between, in this case, very sophisticated academic knowledge to real-world application at Kaiser Permanente. And it's that connection. It is about college and career, but not in isolation from each other. It is about what we call linked learning. It is connecting really challenging academics with demanding technical education in ways that help students understand, why do I need to know this?
And so let me throw it back over here. As you think about this, Kim, and you think about this notion of linking the learning, it begs the question for me, can we accomplish career readiness? What are the elements that we need to attend to in career readiness through programming and integrated learning alone, or are there other things that we also need to do in order to be able to realize that vision?
Well, I think Gary's example of Palmdale High School is a phenomenal example of, you're starting to see silos and lines blending. Typically in a program where there's CTE classes and academic classes, right? There's CTE certified teachers over here, they're down one wing, the academic teachers are over here, they're down another wing. A biology teacher would not be talking about anything related to a career. So it's a fundamental rethinking of roles and responsibilities in that school system. To me, the term that keeps coming up is silo smashing. It's about really thinking about an environment that creates challenging, good, real learning experiences. And the label that we put on in terms of what the teacher is called or what the class is called or what type of credit it is really is irrelevant. I mean, we put up those barriers in terms of saying you have to have so many credits of these kinds of courses to graduate. Well, if that class does it count as a biology class, a health sciences class, a CTE class? It was good real world learning that was college level work. And so, I think in order to accomplish this, it really is a fundamental rethinking of who delivers the instruction, how we count credit. So I think there are a lot of policy implications as well for this. That said, I don't think that we have to allow the existing systems to be a barrier to making progress. Certainly a number of the examples that Gary has, and even examples in Massachusetts, still have pretty traditional structures, and they're still able to accomplish this good work.
Great. Bob, it looks like you've got some thoughts.
Yeah, I think a huge missing piece here, if we are going to get serious about careers and career planning, is career information and counseling much earlier in the system. If in fact people are going to come into high school and make choices to choose among a variety of programs like the various kinds of career options that Gary and his colleagues have put together in California, kids and their families need much better information than they now have about careers, what the requirements are, both academic and others, and how these careers look in terms of how the labor market is moving. I think that again, as Susan pointed out, the fact that we all kind of have in our heads this paradigm from an earlier era, that if you simply got yourself a 4-year degree, it didn't really matter what the subject matter was, what you majored in, what you actually learned, that the labor market would simply automatically reward that credential. Obviously, that is no longer the case. So it seems to me it's equally important for people who are totally fixed on the 4-year college path to have some understanding about careers so they can make more intelligent choices about what they're going to major in, what they're going to study, as it is for kids for whom that is, for a variety of reasons, not a very attractive option. I do think, just one last comment in this arena, and that is that I think for a lot of us who did perfectly well in our own schooling because we were perfectly okay sitting in classrooms, and have moved into careers where we mostly sit at desks, we tend to value the kinds of occupations that we're in ourselves, and I think we just need to understand that particular model for an awful lot of kids doesn't really work very well. If the first order of business for us has to be to get many more kids over the high school graduation threshold. Part of the answer to that is designing the kind of engaging programs that Gary was describing that really do enable kids to understand why it is that they should pay attention to kind of the academic portion of their program so they can see real world applications. But I also believe for a lot of kids it's wanting to be in situations where they are well before graduating from high school, learning at the workplace, engaged in service learning, internships, so they can begin to see the next step in their careers, and they can begin. And we need to fashion ways to link together academic learning and work-based learning, not only in the last years of high school, but we need to do that in a seamless way that pulls kids across the high school graduation threshold and connects them to community colleges or other post-secondary programs that have strong employer engagement and that can lead them to the kind of credentials that really do have currency in the workplace.
Paul, you've got some thoughts, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, taking all these comments from my colleagues here, it brings me back to sort of a fundamental philosophical underpinning of what we're about in education. And part of what we're about is connectedness. Early in my career, I wrote a paper called Educating for Connectedness, which was about, this was when I worked in the field of experiential education, which was focused on internships as a way of involving students in a more serious quest toward academic learning. The idea being that our job as educators is to link them up with meaning and with a meaningful application of knowledge, which is what Gary's program is about. We have a program, Harvard Medical School runs a high school biosciences program, which does the same thing, runs simulations in the hospital, and then they go back to the high schools, and in advanced courses, those kids work on the concepts and systems in ways that just never came alive when it was in a textbook. But when they did sort of a workup on an asthma patient who collapsed in the middle of the Boston Marathon and did that with a real simulator in a hospital setting, they wanted to learn that, and their learning imprinted in big ways. So I think that frames for us who work in educational policy and leadership, we have a curriculum and instructional challenge to figure out how do we take the best of career technical education and applied knowledge and bring it into mainstream comprehensive high schools? How do we build the capacity of the schools to do that work? How do we at the same time, we're adding, as we always do as policymakers, to the work that we want educators in the field to do. So how do we add that connective tissue that enables these internships to happen, enables these off-campus programs to happen? They don't happen magically. If we're to take Dewey's axiom seriously, that learning is thinking about experience, how do we structure that time in ways that will get the most out of it from an educational standpoint? And that's additional capacity and a different way of viewing instruction. It will probably take more time. Jennifer Davis from the National Center on Time and Learning is here, and they've been doing a lot of thinking about this work. So how do we build out time that enables young people to have the kinds of experiences that make their academic work more meaningful and motivating for them? As policymakers, we never talk much about student motivation or student engagement because it's hard to make policy that really affects that. But I think at its heart, connectedness is what we need to do to address that.
So Kim and Gary, when we think about connectedness and we think about career exposure, really working with students around not only what are their options and what's out there, but the other proclivities that Bob and Paul talked about, how early should we be doing that? What can that look like within schools? If you, schools across the country, many might have an opportunity to engage in a career tech environment where you have things available to you for hands-on, or might be able to take a partnership opportunity to go off-site. But what if they can't go off-site? What do you do? What are some of the emerging strategies that you're seeing at the state level or at the local level for early career exposure and some of these other really important aspects that we're talking about?
Go ahead.
I was going to say, to answer the question about time, I think that's a huge question, a huge issue. I mean, we can't wait to just begin these conversations in the 11th grade or 12th grade. I mean, it's too late. The choices that people have made, and I mean, I'm not saying it's unrecoverable, but it's not preferable. I mean, we should begin, we look at the numbers in terms of dropouts. I mean, 9th grade, that transition between 8th and 9th grade, we need to begin these conversations much earlier. I mean, our organization would love to say middle school or even upper elementary school, but people get very nervous about that and think that you're talking about pigeonholing people into a job. I mean, we're really talking about, and I think that's an important distinction, is this is not about job preparation. This is about that career skills for a lifetime of success. And so while some of what you learn are specific technical skills, that is only a small element of this bigger picture. So we would encourage much earlier beginning conversations. A number of states have started to put in place graduation plans that have career exploration activities beginning in the middle school and have plans in place that are required to be reviewed annually in terms of looking at workplace learning experiences as part of that required component. I know Gary's done a great deal of work of that in California. Those exposures, I think, are also important not only for the student but for the parent, because a big part of this conversation is about changing the public's perception about what is success. And right now, the voting public, it's still four-year college degree. So we need to break that mindset mindset. And I think the way that we do that is through exposure and information. So the parents need to be part of this process, as well as educating the parents that the choices that are being made aren't limiting. I think that's a big concern a lot of people have, is when you start to get kind of this perception of a career track, you're limiting options for students. And if anything, really powerful opportunities are expanding options for students. Gary?
Great.
Yeah, so just to build on that, and I believe that career information, career awareness is important. I think that's really important. But when we do this work in high schools and even now in K-8, this is not about encouraging students to choose a career. That's not its purpose. It's giving students the opportunity to practice a career, to learn what it's like. What is it that a physician's assistant at Kaiser does? What is it that an engineer at Chevron does? What is it that a teacher does? Those students at Palmdale High School, many of them, they're all going on to some form of post-secondary. About half to 4-year, about half to 2-year. Most of them do not go on in the health field. But they got the academic foundation. They got the introduction to, in some cases, occupationally specific. Many of them graduate with a certificate in phlebotomy. Gives them a leg up in the labor market while they're going to post-secondary. They don't have to work for minimum wage. But that's not the primary point. The primary goal is to get that academic and technical foundation that exposes them to systems thinking. I mean, again, that was a lesson about the cardiovascular system. And it's introducing students to, well, what's the difference between open and closed systems? What's the role of feedback and throughput? And it's that kind of generalized knowledge that is not part of most individual academic disciplines that career pathway exposes those students to. And that's its purpose. That's its point. It's not about choosing a career.
And I would just say, you know, the other thing is that those students in that class were living and doing what many of us called SCAN skills, employability skills. It was seamless. It wasn't taught as a separate course, which is one of the policy things that I would encourage you not to do, which is that some places have created these, let's do an employability skills course. Well, that's just, I mean, that is not going to accomplish what it is that we're looking for. We're trying to integrate these concepts in a way that creates an authentic experience. In our working world, we don't do employability skills from 9 to 10 and academic from 10 to 11 and technical skills from 11 to 12. It is that true integration of those skills. And I think the challenging part of a lot of this conversation is when we start to think about then, okay, so what does this mean for standards? What does this mean for assessment? That we get ourselves, I think, to a point of making it impossible because we have so many systems pieces in place, and I think overcomplicate the realities of being able to do what they did in Palmdale High School.
Great. Bob?
Yeah, I just want to comment on two earlier points. The first one around this question of changing parental views and the challenge of creating more kind of social legitimacy, if you will, around pathways other than the 4-year college. I really have been struck by the response to our pathways report on that dimension. I and my colleagues have done a lot of talk shows and been out in the field talking to folks. And I actually think on this one the pendulum is beginning to swing. The degree of economic anxiety out there among the population at large, especially middle-class families, the rising cost of college, and the increasing attention in the press to the fact that a college degree is no longer a guarantee, is actually forcing parents to kind of think hard about this investment and whether or not they can be assured that there will be the kind of return on the investment in a 4-year institution that typically has been there. And an awful lot of the parents who phone in to these talk shows that I've been on essentially talk about the kind of the challenge of having, say 2 kids, one of whom sailed through high school, clearly, loved academics, was perfectly fine sitting at a desk and learning, and then the second kid who equally bright, different learning style, turned off by the notion of 4 more years, of higher education, and the need to create socially legitimate alternative strategies that can, again, also produce kind of positive results for future labor market success. So that to me is at least, we begin to see some change there. I also wanted to, in terms of Gary's comment about the focus being on kind of practice, understanding systems, et cetera. One of the, if you look at our Pathways report, you'll see that we draw pretty heavily on evidence from Northern European countries, a whole set of countries where in upper secondary education, meaning typically from the junior year on, anywhere between 40 and 70% of kids are moving into programs that combine work and learning, have heavy employer engagement, some mostly school-based, some mostly work-based, but all typically 3-year programs that culminate in certificates that really are closely aligned with real labor market needs. Those countries do not believe that kids at 16 or 17 is too young to begin thinking more seriously about careers and to move into a program that gives kids not only some occupationally skill-specific kinds of skills, but also has a very broad focus in terms of sort of employability skills, adaptability, et cetera, kind of writ large. Now, even in Germany, one of the most highly structured programs, roughly 20% of young people after they graduate in their first year move from one sector to another, not just from one career. But the preparation is strong enough so that they are able to move successfully. That economy, by the way, and not just the German economy, manufacturing is still a very, very strong base in those countries, and the role of kind of the skilled craftsperson is a highly respected figure in those cultures. You can't simply transplant programs or strategies that work from one culture to another, but we would argue there's a lot for American educators and employers to learn from looking at this range of programs from Switzerland, Germany, Austria, Norway, Finland, Denmark, the Netherlands, again, all with programs that, as I say, really are mainstream programs serving a very broad range of kids, preparing kids for a very broad range of occupations, white collar as well as blue collar, and that all of which are designed to be closely aligned with not just where the current labor market is, but where the emerging trends are in those societies.
Again, a policy and political implication of what Bob has just talked about is many of these countries are the countries that are held up as having the highest academic achievement in the world and the ones that we ought to be aspiring to reach. What we've adopted as a strategy frequently in response to that is the notion that we should whip our accountability system harder, test people more, set the goals ever higher, but not think so much about the strategies for closing those gaps, or bear down and look at what's going on in a place like Finland, which really leads the competition in many ways. And you look back and you see this infrastructure and underpinning where students are engaged in the application of knowledge, where student engagement with applying knowledge is much higher, and this kind of pipeline phenomenon sets in place as early as 15 or 16, and it is not taking away from academic success, but to the contrary, seems to be contributing to success in ways in which shouldn't be surprising for us. Because when we go, for example, when I visit high schools around our state, one of the things I worry most about as I go through our comprehensive high schools is boredom, is large numbers of kids going through the motions of what's a socially prescribed ritual, but without much meaning to them. They're doing it because this is what they're expected to do. Conversely, when I go into many of the career technical high schools, you see kids with a spring in their step and a sense of engagement and purpose, and a belief that what they're doing in school actually has some hope for them of translating into a meaningful, positive, constructive future. That's an ingredient in education that we can ill afford to ignore as policymakers. What is it that's bringing about that subtle but important difference in the way kids engage with learning?
Great.
I had a quick point just on that one, which is, in addition to the kids kind of just going through the motions in high school, there's a very powerful book that came out, a short study by 2 sociologists that appeared right around the time that our Pathways report appeared. It's called Academically Adrift. And again, it looks at a cross-section of kids in 4-year higher ed institutions. As you might guess from the title, its point is that there are an awful lot of kids who simply drift into college because there's no other socially legitimate place for them to go. They're not strongly motivated, they don't know why they're there, they're not sure what they're studying, and guess what? When you actually look at what kids have learned, the learning that takes place over the first 2 years in these four-year institutions, roughly 45% of kids show no significant change or improvement around analytic thinking, reasoning, writing. That is the kind of core academic skills that we think all colleges, no matter what the major is, ought to be part of the sort of fundamental reason why kids are going to school. So the drift issue to me is a really significant one.
Well, and this notion around degrees for what? Degrees in what?
Right.
What is the connection, the authentic connection to engagement and to the economy? How do students put that together becomes an important piece as well as we think through this. So if this is a courageous conversation, if there are many elements that we need to make sure that we're very thoughtful about, careful about, to avoid student tracking, to make sure that we don't repeat some of the mistakes of the past, and that we keep in mind those students who we most need to see succeeding, who in many cases are not succeeding right now. What needs to be our next step in this conversation? And then I'm going to let Gary close with an illustration of something that he wants to share. So why don't I start with you, Bob, and we'll move our way through.
Sure. One reason I put so much emphasis on the early information about careers and counseling and advice is if we are going to avoid the pitfalls of the past where schools were making judgments about which kids had academic potential and which kids didn't, and move toward a system where we try to make sure that all kids have a really solid academic foundation, which has really been the kind of core argument, if you will, of the standards movement. And then at some point, really allow for some differentiation based on good information and based on what kids and parents together decide it makes the most sense. And I'd argue that, again, from the European experience, that roughly around the junior year is a point at which we could really begin to allow for some more differentiation. If that system is going to work, as I say, it really has to rest on a very solid base of information and counseling that begins, I'd argue, as Kim was suggesting, well before high school.
Okay. Paul?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that we've made enormous progress with the Standards and Accountability Framework. And in Massachusetts, we're very proud of the success that we've enjoyed. But we're also quite cognizant of the fact that we still have persistent, profound achievement gaps. And that we've got to think differently about creating learning opportunities for all students. All means all. And in this career area, I think we get the advantages that we've discussed earlier about motivation and engagement. I think in order to do that, we've got to be thinking about the implications for curriculum instruction, about broadening how we teach, who does the teaching, and what they engage with. I think we need to think about the time involved. I think we need to think about differentiating. Different students need different kinds of opportunities. Some come by exposure to career information, career experience naturally through their own lives. Others don't. And I think we need to build the capacity of schools to do some different kinds of work with the additional time that's necessary. So we need to hybridize the system and allow for experimentation in this area rather than a tighter one-size-fits-all kind of rigidity.
So I do a lot of work from the kind of federal policy perspective, and I think one of the challenges, if I were in your seat, were to go back and look at all of the requirements, the federal money you get, and the buckets that it comes in, and then try to figure out how you start to use those resources to blend the silos that exist in order to be able to achieve this goal of college and career readiness for all students. And I think that's one of the things that I would hope for, is that when you go back and have the conversation about what policies need to be put on the table, that you have everybody at the table. Nobody can really kind of own this singularly in a state, and if you do, it stands the kind of fear of becoming another fad. This needs to be having everybody at the table, the academic teachers, the CTE community, the secondary and post-secondary community, about creating fundamental change. It can't just be owned by one segment of the community. The other thing is that I do think that in a world where accountability is paramount, we need to make sure that some measures are put in place related to this conversation. And that if we're looking at credentials, perhaps putting in place other credentials as another value in terms of something that gives recognition. At the local level, we know that counselors are often driven by the number of scholarships they get or the name of the college a student goes to. Well, what if we made it as valuable to have a certain number of industry credentials or the wages that somebody earns as a result of going into a program? And the last thing that I'm sorry we didn't get to talk about is really the role of business partners. The business partners are so key to this. It's something that I think is an advantage to having career tech at the table because we've had that relationship for a long time. It's one that is tricky though. I mean, we have a group of employers that are, I think, in some ways encouraging us to do things the old way, to say, I need a welder today. And then we have people who are more systems thinkers like Kaiser, who are willing to be more flexible and say we need innovators and people who are educating. And so I think the message that we're getting from business is not always consistent, but having that voice at the table is also important.
Great.
So I started by taking you to Palmdale High School. I'd like to close. Susan, you asked how early should this start? So I'm going to take you to a kindergarten class in Answer Elementary outside of Boise, Idaho. Any of you have 5-year-olds or grandchildren who are 5-year-olds just starting school? So, and many of you probably have had 5-year-olds. Think about your 5-year-old. Could I have the slide? Well, let's see.
See, the 5-year-old could get the slide.
Yeah, this is, Phyllis, we've still got problems with 21st century. There we go. So we're an Answer Elementary is an expeditionary learning school. I don't know if you know expeditionary learning. They're offshoot of Outward Bound. This is a kindergarten class, and they've been asked to draw this butterfly. And there's a little boy, Austin, who draws the butterfly. Now, those of you who know 5-year-olds, that looks like pretty much what you would expect from a 5-year-old, right? It looks like a 5-year-old butterfly. And in most schools, it stops there. But not at Answer. At Answer, the teacher gathers the children on the rug, and they critique each other's drawings. And the students say, you know, Austin, that's a good first draft, but it doesn't really look like that, not yet. And Austin says, okay, I'll do it again. And the children gather on the rug, and they say, Austin, you know, that's really better. You got the swallows, but you know, the wings are still pretty angular. Austin says, okay, I'll do it again. And they gather on the rug and they look at Austin's butterfly and they say, Austin, it's getting better. It's getting better, but you know, the wings aren't quite right yet. Austin says, okay, I'll do it again. And the kids say, wow, Austin, that is terrific. But you know, you don't really have the patterns in the wing yet. And Austin says, okay, I'll do it again. And they gather on the rug and they look at Austin the butterfly and they say, Austin, that's awesome. And Austin says, okay, can I color it now? And that is Austin's butterfly. But it doesn't stop there. Next year, they do birds. And I'm sorry, I didn't have enough for every table, but on your table is a note card. And the 5-year-olds the next year do birds. But they turn these birds into note cards. You have them on your tables. And they sell them in service stations and convenience stores throughout Idaho to raise money for wildlife conservation and bird rehabilitation. These are 5-year-olds who are engaged in a school-based enterprise, who have turned something beautifully designed and turned it into a useful product. And they have learned how to do that. This is what college and career readiness is about. This is what it means to connect these two, whether in kindergarten or in 12th grade or further on in post-secondary. Austin's Butterfly.
As Gary was sharing this with me earlier today, one of the things that struck me is this revision process that we go through with students is the same process that we all go through every day in the work that we do. We ask ourselves the questions, we test it with our colleagues, we go back and we make it better. That engineering design process in the work that we do every day is a critical career-ready skill that we want to instill in all our students. But it's also the process of refinement and conversation that we need to go through to get to the right vision and answer as we seek to really have this expanded notion of career readiness. So we look forward to continuing that conversation with the group in this room, and I want to thank our panelists for having this conversation with us today. Yeah, I think we have time for a question or two from the audience.
I'm Amy Mast from Georgia. I'm Director of P20 Council in Georgia.
She's bringing you a mic.
Okay, thank you. Amy Mast from Georgia with our Alliance of Education Agency Heads, our P20 Council. We are very focused in Georgia on implementing the Common Core state standards and also engaging our post-secondary and business partners with our state school superintendent, John Barge, and his vision of creating a very robust system of career pathways. I just would love to hear a little bit more about the role of the Common Core state standards in defining career readiness.
Well, I guess I would say I think it's a start. And I might be the dissenter on this panel, but I think if you were to think about college and career readiness as being one bucket of stuff for everybody, there is a nucleus there, but depending on the career path that you choose, it will vary. So if I'm going to go into engineering, the academics that I need may well extend beyond the common academic core, and the technical courses I take might be different. Similarly, if I'm going into the arts field, that might be that common academic core is a good start, but you might need some additional kind of technical skills to be able to qualify you in terms of being able to get into a good post-secondary institution. So I think that we've established a good foundation. I don't think that the common academic core is enough for some people depending on what career path you've chosen. So you may need to look beyond that as well for the academic areas in addition to the technical areas.
I don't know, London. I mean, from our standpoint, the Common Core adds broader, deeper, more career-sensitive kinds of goals to aim at. But the real challenge is closing the gaps. And the important conversation for us is what are the strategies that are going to enable to engage and educate our students to this high, broad level that we've now signed on to in the Common Core standards. So we need to shift the conversation from kind of an endless dialogue about the target, the standards, to a conversation about what are the strategies that we're going to use to close the gaps that even in a high standard state like Massachusetts, we already had before adopting the Common Core. Now we adopt the Common Core and that gap just got even bigger. And so the question becomes, what's the curriculum? What's the instructional strategy? What's the capacity for our educational system? What kind of time do we need? How do we differentiate our approach to meet the kids where they are and give them what they need to attain those standards?
If I could build on that, and I'm a big fan of the Common Core, but I think one of the difficult conversations that was touched on that we haven't had here is whether the press for uniform standards is really at odds with what we all know is highly differentiated excellence. So for example, what you need to know and be able to do to get into and succeed at MIT is very different from what you need to know and be able to do and succeed at the Juilliard School of Music. Both epitomize excellence. This is not about a lower standard for some and a higher standard for others. It's about different higher standards. And recognizing that none of us, or very few of us, certainly not I, is capable of doing everything well. And how do we struggle with that? In this business of defining standards, assessments, pathways, different kinds of post-secondary options, we really have to address that and do it in a way that recognizes that equity for all students has to underlie the way we take that issue on. And that is a very hard conversation that we need to have.
That's the courageous part.
Yeah.
Not sure where the mic's going first here.
Hi, Jason Tishko, State of Illinois. We've talked a lot about how college readiness has informed a lot of our accountability metrics, and we've built out these extensive K-12 and post-secondary education longitudinal data systems to be able to track those metrics, and now they're really helping inform accountability across the board. And now that we're talking about really college and career readiness, we're starting to look at how our workforce and employment data systems could help inform that process. So I was just wondering if the panel could share their views on how employment data, workforce data, labor market information is going to be informing accountability standards across the P20 system in the future.
That's a great question. I hesitate to make a prediction about how that's going to happen, but I think it puts a really important point squarely on the table, and that is that the things we most want to know about our K-12 education system really can't be answered unless we have the capacity to actually follow young people as they make the transition, whether it's to a post-secondary institution, to employment, or some combination of the two. And developing our data systems to enable us to do that and to make sure that that information gets fed back into the schools, so you've got a kind of continuous learning, continuous improvement model, it strikes me is just extremely important. I don't know kind of what the normal state of practice is out there, but I can remember when I worked in the Boston, with the Boston school system years ago, the schools would survey kids in May of their senior year and ask them what their intentions were, and they would report that as follow-up data, as if what kids told you in May of their senior year had any relationship to what they were going to be doing even in September, let alone a year or two or three later. We've got to get much better at actually having a real way to actually follow up young people as they move into the workforce, as they move into post-secondary education, as they move into civic life.
It's expensive to do that, of course,
Yep.
which is why we don't do it. We've had some experiments in our state with doing
Sampling.
follow-on studies of graduates in particular classes and looking at them 5 years out. And it's very interesting. And it suggests a kind of consumer consciousness mentality that we don't have in education. When we talk about accountability, we have sort of proxy standards, how you do on a test, and we assume that test performance relates to success in college or relates to success in career. But we haven't really done the detailed work of asking college faculty, are they well prepared? And where are they well prepared? Where are they not so well prepared? Or furthermore, asking employers, to what degree are they really ready to do the kinds of jobs that you have? We anecdotally have a lot of experience with that, but we don't do it in a systematic way, asking the end users how they feel the product that we've prepared in elementary and secondary education is well prepared or not for the tasks that are ahead of them.
So that continued conversation with business, with employers, amongst the kinds of stakeholder groups that we have in this room really just puts more of that conversation on your shoulders in order to not only to determine a better and more refined definition of career readiness, but then how is it that we're going to measure that with the systems that we go forward?
If I can add, I mean, I think that in an era when resources are difficult, the role of labor market data and projections become more important, or at least people are talking about it more in terms of making choices of what offerings are out there. And I don't think, I think that actually is a good conversation to have, because clearly we have a disconnect of a lot of educated people, but we still have a skills gap. And so we need to figure out how to better kind of match kind of where people's interests are, what their education experiences are, and what our economy really looks like. Part of that, in my mind, is truth-telling to people about what options are out there, depending on what career area you get. The caution, though, is that as soon as you start talking about that, people start going back into the mode of, you're going to force my child to be an X, and the economy is changing so much, and so how do I know that if they go into X career that they're still going to be well prepared? And so I think it speaks to what some of the panelists have talked about of, this is really not about just the focus on technical skills. The career readiness is really those broader transcending skills that allow you that ability to be nimble as the economy changes. And that's a critical part of this conversation.
I think we are at the end of our time, and I know that we have a professor who has the first day of class today back in Boston, so we need to let him go. But again, I want to thank the panelists for their contribution and look forward to more conversations.